gentlemen. Welcome to the November meeting of the Committee of Faculty Staff Administration. I just would like to start this meeting off in sending our sincere condolences to Vice Chancellor Waters, whose husband passed last week on Sunday. I've spoken to her this morning, and she is doing as well as one can expect. And I sent her my best wishes and let her know that we were all thinking about her. The service is, in case you're into the memorial service, is this Saturday, and I believe the university has sent out that information. So continue to keep her in your thoughts and prayers. With that, I'd like to move on and approve of the minutes of the meeting of April 6th. Right? The last meeting?
September 9th.
Okay. Call for a vote to approve item 1A, the minutes of September 9th, 2015.
Second.
It's been moved and second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstentions, the motion carries. Thank you very much. Could I have President Jennifer Rabb please present item 1B1, amendments to the governance plan of Hunter College.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. These amendments that were passed by our Senate represent, in essence, first some cleanup work that have our charter represent what is actually taking place within this school. So our school of urban public health is actually treated as a department for promotion and tenure purposes, and we wanted to make sure that was clear in the charter. In addition, as a division, which is the next step in the tenure promotion process, nursing health professions and urban public health comprise a division, and that was not clear in the governance, so we wanted to make sure that that was clear, so that the structure in the charter reflected how we were actually taking the academic business of promotion and tenure. A second part of this governance amendment was also to give us a little bit more flexibility in leadership, and specifically, the chair and the vice chair of the Senate had been allowed to serve 3 consecutive terms, and we asked for this amendment to allow them to serve 4 if they so wish. So it gave us a little bit more continuity when we did have strong leadership. And then the second piece of this in leadership was a timing issue to make sure that the terms coordinated with our exam periods, and that the Senate worked out with the flow of the calendar. So we spent some time last year at our Charter Reform Committee of our Senate, really making sure that our practices, this charter conformed with current practices, and we seek your approval of those amendments today.
Thank you. I move the amendment. May I have a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention, the motion carries.
Thank you so much.
Would President Matosa Rodriguez to join us to present items 1B3 through 1B5, 3 naming opportunities at Queens College.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great to be here. 3 naming opportunities. The first is the Claude Paliska Glass Display and Archives case. Dr. Paliska was a graduate from our college and taught music at Yale. And his wife and he have been longtime donors to the college. They established a gift of $10,000 for a scholarship fund, and they also left a fund close to $750,000 for the music library fund. So in honor of their contributions to the college, beautiful glass display, which you go in before the library, is going to be named after them. That's the first item. Sol Novak was a Dean of Arts and Humanities at Queens College and taught in our music school, and helped create the Copeland School of Music. And his daughter, Carol, who's a poet, also linked to the college, have also donated close to $258,000 for a scholarship fund. So we're naming a practice room in the music school after him. That's the second item. And then the last item is a faculty lounge after Charles Weeks, who were graduates of the college and have also donated, left a gift of $3,000 to $28,000 to the college for scholarships and students who wanted to do writing and were English majors.
Thank you. I may I have a motion for approval.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
It's been moved in second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention, the motion carries. Congratulations.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, I'd like to move ahead now to consider our Chancellor University report matters. We will then return to the policy calendar to discuss items 1B5 and 1B6. For President, please introduce item 1C1, appointment at an interim vice president at Bronx Community College.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good
And I
afternoon.
promise you, by the end of this year, I'm going to know how to
Good
say it.
afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is when I came on board in August. We didn't have a VP for Finance and Administration, and being new to the system, I needed somebody that could really help me manage the whole of that area. With the recommendation of the Chancellor and the Vice Chancellor, Mark Sampiezia, they recommended Richard Elliott to me to serve as the interim Vice Chancellor while we do the search. The search is currently underway. Richard works 3 days a week at the college. Richard is very familiar with the CUNY system. I'm actually retired as VP for Finance and Administration from LaGuardia. So he's been very, very, very helpful to me in running that show.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, he's not here with me this afternoon.
Fine. May I have a motion for approval?
So
Move
moved.
Second.
Second.
It's been moved in second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention, the motion carries.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
President Ricardo Fernandez, please join us to present items 1C2, an interim appointment at Lehman College.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to present Dr. Milton Santiago for appointment as interim VP for workforce education, workforce development, and continuing education. Dr. Santiago has a long history of association with CUNY and Lehman. He started many years ago as my assistant, and then subsequent to that, he left to work on his doctorate. He has held a position as Vice President for Administration at the College of Staten Island for several years. Then he went and worked in the University of Massachusetts system, Field State College. And subsequent to that, he joined us. He's here now, and I'm presenting him for approval for this position, which is very important given the developments in workforce development in the Bronx and in New York City.
And will he be considered for beyond interim, or is he just under consideration? Is he eligible?
He is eligible,
Okay.
yes.
May I have a motion for approval?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
It's been moved in second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention, the motion carries. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.
We will now return to item 1B5 regarding proposed amendments to the university's optional retirement and tax deferred annuity plans. I will ask Estras Tulia, Deputy to the Vice Chancellor for Human Resources Management, to present this resolution.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
The 5 provisions of this resolution implement changes to the operation of the university's optional retirement plan and tax-deferred annuity plan in order to improve CUNY's ability to properly administer the plans, reduce plan costs, and enhance the investment options available to plan participants. Specifically, the resolution provides that the university's tax-deferred annuity plan will be amended to add a Roth account option. A Roth account is a valuable savings option that allows participants to contribute to the tax-deferred annuity plan on an after-tax basis. If certain requirements are met, the contributions plus earnings can be withdrawn tax-free. The availability of the Roth account will be in addition to a participant's current right to contribute amounts to the tax-deferred annuity plan on a before-tax basis. The resolution also authorizes the Board Committee on Faculty, Staff, and Administration to develop specific recommendations of mutual funds for the university's tax-deferred annuity plan. The tax-deferred annuity plan currently offers participants a range of annuity accounts as investment options. The plan's investment advisor has recommended offering additional mutual funds from TIAA-CREF and MetLife to enhance the investment choices available to plan participants. Still another provision of the resolution authorizes establishment of revenue credit accounts that will be funded by TIAA-CREF based on revenues generated by the optional retirement plan and tax-deferred annuity plan. A revenue credit account is a plan account funded by excess revenue earned by the investment provider, above and beyond what is needed to service the plans. Establishment of these accounts will provide CUNY with additional resources to operate the plans. TIAA-CREF will calculate annually the amount that it will contribute to the revenue credit accounts based on revenues in excess of a target amount agreed to by the university. It is important to note that funds in the revenue credit accounts belong to the respective plans, not to the university. Consequently, the funds can only be used to pay certain expenses associated with operating the plans or as additional contributions to participants' accounts. The Vice Chancellor for Human Resources Management will report annually to the Board of Trustees on expenditures paid out of either revenue credit account. The resolution also amends the tax-deferred annuity plan to eliminate, effective January 1, 2016, what is referred to as the special catch-up election under IRS Code Section 402G7. This is a special IRS code rule that allows an employee who has completed 15 years of service with the university to contribute an additional amount to the tax-deferred annuity plan if, in previous years, his or her contributions were significantly less than the maximum permissible amount. But the formula for determining the correct catch-up amount is very complex and requires considerable data from both CUNY and the fund record keepers. Calculation errors violate IRS rules, resulting in tax liabilities to the employee and potential fines for the university. Because only a small number of employees can benefit from this rule, we have determined that it makes sense to eliminate this option. This will simplify plan administration and also reduce costs. Instead, participants may make pre-tax contributions to the New York State Deferred Compensation Plan in addition to any contributions made to the tax-deferred annuity plan. CUNY will retain the H-50 catch-up option. Lastly, the resolution limits the number of loans available to a participant from the optional retirement plan and the tax-deferred annuity plan to 5 outstanding loans at any one time. Also, no loan would be available to a participant who has defaulted on a loan from either the optional retirement plan or the tax-deferred annuity plan. IRS limits on the amount of money that can be borrowed by participants from their retirement accounts, but CUNY currently places no restrictions on the number of loans that participants can take from the optional retirement plan and the tax-deferred annuity plans. Our review has shown that some participants regularly have many outstanding loans, as well as an unacceptable default rate. This adds complexity and cost to the administration of the plans. This represents a significant change in our current policy, but one consistent with best practices in the retirement plans of other higher education institutions around the country. Madam Chair, I present item 1B5 for the committee's consideration.
Thank you. The recommendations in this resolution are the result of more than a year's work of the Pension Advisory Task Force, which I chair, and whose members are comprised of my colleague, Trustee Terrence Martell, and representatives from the university's Office of Human Resource Management, Budget and Finance, and the Office of the General Counsel. I want to say that it has been my pleasure to chair the committee. We had not looked at these retirement plans in many, many, many years as a university. And I will ask Michael Webb, who is from CAMIC, to just talk about 3 basic things. How much money we've saved our constituents thus far, and some of the best practices that we're looking at going forward, and basically, in a few words, why we're doing this. Michael
you.
Webb is with Camic Retirement, who is, and they are our financial advisor, which I might add, does not cost the university out of the fund that we just talked about. He's paid out of those excess revenues. So we're the one committee that doesn't cost the university any money.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. In the relatively short time the task force has been in place, we have actually negotiated a cost savings in terms of the fees that the participants pay in excess of $2.5 million. That $2.5 million is an annual savings and will only increase as plan assets increase. But that is not the end of the process. And I think the $2.5 million in savings is a starting point for future negotiations with the record keepers that will result in additional savings to the participants in the plan. As was pointed out, it is a savings to the plan. State law pretty much restricts the use of revenue credit accounts to the plan of participants. And we will work very diligently on the task force of applying those savings to participants. But in very simple terms, it means they get cheaper investments that are less costly to them. Because anytime we can increase that savings number, it can be applied directly to the investments in the plan. In terms of the work is not done, though we intend to try to move the work forward as fast as expedient a fashion as possible. I think this should be looked at as the starting changes to the plan, if you will, and we will strongly consider within the task force some additional changes to the plan that not only will result in additional cost savings for participants, but also greatly streamline administration. Administration is very, very difficult with the plan right now because there are many outside parties involved in the plan, record keepers, agents, and other third parties, et cetera. So we're going to really take a serious look on the committee of streamlining those third parties, if you will.
Thank you. And I might add that this has been reviewed and discussed with the unions and those who are involved. So it's not just the committee. We have the input of the unions. So this has been a wonderful process, in my opinion. I will now call for
We didn't move it,
oh,
so we need to move it.
can we move the approval of the amendments 1B5?
I'd like to move it.
Second, and are there any questions?
I just want to comment, want to thank you for your leadership you've shown in this process. You've always been kind and considerate, almost always. That's a private joke. But it was from a personal perspective, a great deal of satisfaction recognizing that each meeting we knocked off some costs that will directly benefit the participants in the plan. So it isn't always you see the direct result of your work. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So Valerie, is the committee going to be continuing then?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So its work is, you say its
This
work
is,
is,
so what we're doing is each couple of months, we'll bring you a few items.
Okay.
And we have a long-term agenda, but they continue to negotiate with the parties. And then we, rather than bringing everything to you at the end, we'll bring you a few resolutions as we go forward and clean it up. And then ultimately, by the end of this program year, we will have significantly cleaned up the process.
well, I think you deserve the thanks of the board for taking leadership on this thing. This thing had been sorely neglected for many years.
So it's been a pleasure. I work with a wonderful group. President
Madam
Hughes.
Chair, I wanted to know, so when we pass these today, are these immediately implementable once they go to the trustees, or do we wait for the rest to happen before we implement?
I'll ask Michael to address that.
Every item in this resolution is immediately implemented. Keep in mind that some of them have more work attached to them. It's merely a board authorization for us to do more work. But some of them are concrete items, such as the elimination of the 15-year catch-up, the establishment for the first time of a revenue credit account to benefit the plan and participants. Those will take effect immediately after the board authorizes them.
And the loans.
Right. One of the things that we are asking is that whomever are the successful record keepers, in the end, part of their deliverables will be their evaluation process will be how successful they will be in educating the constituents about the plan. So that while it will not be the responsibility solely of the Department of Human Resources, that in our assessment of who should be the winning entities, that they are being evaluated on how successful and how many resources they are willing to commit to that educational process.
Thank you.
So it's been moved in second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention, the motion carries. And thank you, and Michael, see you next week for our next meeting.
Thank you.
I will now call on the Chancellor to talk about the presidential search guideline process.
Thank you. I was just asking when this was going to come up. I should have just waited for you. So, we had been asked by the board to take a look at a couple of elements of the policy, the board's policy on presidential and chancellor searches, specifically provisions relating to interims and the provisions relating to membership. We spent some time reviewing that and made some tentative proposals, tentative draft, which we discussed with some members of the board. We were then asked to take a look at whether or not there are other changes that would be advisable by some board members who had served recently chairing search committees for presidents, and asked whether or not we felt that having a public visits and public release of finalist names inhibited the pools at all, restricted in particular whether sitting presidents were interested in being candidates. I think that we consulted with a group with some of the search consultants with whom we've worked, relied on our own personal experiences, those of us at the Chancery, discussed this with the CUNY presidents, and we developed the current draft. The current draft addresses each of these three elements, proposes a number of other changes essentially to streamline, clean up, provide a little more flexibility in the processes which were pretty rigid before. I think that I planned, but I don't see he has anything in front of him, to ask the General Counsel to review the specific changes. He has a very good memory in his draft of the proposed policy.
I can do that. I think you've covered really the main points. One is the composition of the search committee, which at times when we had a lot of searches going, it wasn't always easy to find 5 trustees. And so rather than mandating 5 trustees on a search committee, the proposed draft would say up to 5. It includes the possibility of the chancellor appointing a senior level administrator or administrators from either the central office or campuses, but with the proviso that the number of trustees and senior level administrators wouldn't be no higher than 5. Those really were the principal changes. On the composition of the committee. There has been both a rule and a moderately frequent exception to the rule about interims being permitted to be considered for presidential appointments. And I think the feeling was it's time to sort of face up to the reality that sometimes they should be and sometimes they shouldn't. And instead of having a rule with an exception, let's just sort of take it on a case-by-case basis. And then perhaps most significantly are the changes having to do with campus visits. And the draft is intended really more to identify the problem than to firmly fix the solution. There are some options proposed, but I think this really was intended as the beginning of a conversation about the nature and extent of the problem and possible solutions in the course of some conversations that we've had even over the last week or so. Some interesting alternative ideas have come up, and I think the idea is to continue that conversation, to hear from the members of the committee today, see whether a consensus develops, not necessarily to take a vote, and then continue that conversation, but fairly intensely, because we've got a whole bunch of searches coming up over the next few weeks, and to see whether we can reach a consensus on what ought to be done.
Madam Chair, Jay has copies of the red line copies that would enable
Right.
members of the committee.
I assume they were out here somewhere.
That would enable members of the committee to actually see what's been dropped and what new language has been added.
But
So
by
I
the way,
think it might be helpful.
The
to
red,
distribute
I
that.
always do this because I think it's fair, only fair for people to see red line copies. This red line looks a little scarier than it is, because in the earlier version of the guidelines, there were like footnotes in the guidelines and other stuff that got redlined out, but the substance of them is still there. So it, as I said, it looks a little, and then there was some introductory language that wasn't really necessary or appropriate. So here it is. But as I said, the main thrust of the changes are the ones that I've just described.
So you're not asking for approval on this today?
No, it was our thought in my discussion with the chair of the committee that we present this today for information of the committee, have some discussion, and that we undertake to discuss with the leadership of the faculty and the student governing bodies that will have some interest in this. The challenges that we're trying to address and what the proposed solutions are.
So, thank you, Mr. Chancellor and Vice Chancellor. I will just sum up and say that I probably have been on, I think I've replaced every, when they see me coming now on the campus, they go, oh my God. But I guess I feel very strongly that our process, I am indebted and in awe of the confidentiality with which the search committees have worked, and the diligence and the time they have committed. And I think the result is that we've had some pretty phenomenal presidents to be appointed. So my perspective is, from that, is to never do anything that would breach that confidentiality. So that's where I start from. And so we are continuing to have conversations about options that would potentially increase the pool, but simultaneously not cause any incentive for any individual or groups of individuals to not respect that confidentiality. So I look forward to continuing these conversations expeditiously, to come to some resolution that the Chancellor and others feel comfortable with. But I wanted, I guess, given that everybody in this table, the other trustees and presidents have sat on these committees, just wanted to get you to have an opportunity to give some feedback and your thoughts about and I guess the biggest one is about the the last one. Would you repeat the last one? Because you don't want me to tell my version of it. About the on-campus visits and the
last
impact.
Right.
You mean
So-
option two?
Well,
No, just what the
the
issue is.
general, so under our current guidelines, the search committee reports out 3 or 4 finalists. And they then visit the campus under guidelines that are quite specific about the extent and nature of those visits, how many people will be in each meeting, which groups will meet with the finalists, and then it ends with a large town hall meeting, which on some occasions people have reported to be less than helpful. But in any event, it lays out quite a lengthy public process. And the concern that some of us have heard from both trustees and from search consultants is the highly public nature of that process, particularly when there are still as many as, say, 4 candidates or finalists left in the running, makes some potential candidates, particularly sitting presidents, leery about throwing their hat into the ring. We've seen this a little less with community college presidents than with, or candidates for community college presidencies and with senior colleges, but it is something that the search consultants and others have identified as a problem. So the question then is, are there ways of consulting with the campus, getting input from the campus, bearing in mind, of course, that the campus has representatives on the search committee at the outset, 3 elected faculty and an elected student, an alumnus. Are there ways of doing campus consultation that are not quite so public and don't potentially scare off applicants? And so when we drafted this, and again, it's preliminary thinking, we looked at what SUNY does, which is pretty much option number 1 that we have asked you to explore. And then what other colleges and universities around the country do, and that's, at least in some cases, captured by option number 2. But there might be other ways of doing this, and so that's really the thrust of the matter. One suggestion that has come up in some recent conversations is that if there were to be campus visits, maybe there ought to be a further, how shall I say it, culling of the group. Let's say 4 are reported out. And of course, at the end of the process, there are interviews by the chancellor, vice chancellors, others. It might be, someone has suggested, that if the number were 2, that instead of 4, and someone thought a candidate had thought he had a 1 in 2 chance of getting it at the end of the process, at the point at which it became public, that might serve as a less of a disincentive for sitting presidents to participate. So there are other ways of approaching this problem, but I think the feeling was among people who are knowledgeable and experienced in this field that there is a real issue here.
Trustee Spartalis.
I had the good fortune of being invited to interview almost every candidate for presidency and met with many of them. I am somewhat sympathetic with some of the issues that are raised in this draft. And I'm not going to speak to this because I just saw it. However, I would have a concern if we found ourselves in a situation where significant representatives from the individual campuses did not have an opportunity to meet with the candidates. Does not have to be on campus, but I think I think there needs to be that sense that there will be the meetings. Looking at it from another perspective, I find it hard to understand why someone would take a job as a president without having a sense of just what he or she were getting themselves into, that only comes with seeing diverse groups and hearing what their issues are. So I'm sure we can find some potential middle ground, but but anything that would exclude participation from any of the significant groups on a campus, I think would probably cause an unintended consequence of signaling to the candidate that there are issues here that should be more fully considered.
And I will tell you what my concern is with option 2. I think the search committee consists of a group of representatives, and the selection of another group of representatives and keeping them confidential, given some of my experiences on the campuses, may not achieve the goal that you set out, which was for their names not to be public. So I think, the conversations, we've done a really good job of keeping, again, the confidentiality amongst the selection group, the panels. And I just think to then create another super panel that is limited to some people but not others, I'd love to hear and flesh out how that would work. So those are my concerns. I did do a little bit of independent research because you said SUNY, and I clearly I'm not the expert in this. So, and I've seen some phenomenal candidates, but I did look at all the presidents currently in the SUNY system, and I did a non-scientific research on the ones that are in the Penn State system, and none of them were sitting presidents. So I wonder whether the issue of public disclosure is the issue that stops people from participating. That there may be other issues that stop that. Because as I said, when I did my very unscientific Google and looked them up, and I saw that from the ones that I looked at, none of them were sitting presidents in either the Penn State nor the SUNY system. So I would just, I bow to the intellect of the search people, but I wonder whether there are other factors that preclude sitting presidents from being part of those searches. So those were,
Sure there are.
yeah.
If I could just say one word, I think that it's clear that this is a balancing of interests. As somebody who has appointed presidents and in the CUNY system recommends the appointment of a single person, I can tell you that I benefit from input in this process and different perspectives. I can also tell you from having been in this business for a long time and having hired a lot of campus leaders that it does have an impact on the pool. And I have done a little more research on this and be happy to share some of that, but it does have an impact on the pool of how many. One of the first things that a sitting president wants to know is the public nature of the search. And most leading universities in the country do not, no private does, but most leading publics don't have a public period at the end of the search where there are 4 candidates who are identified. But having said that, I do believe it's a balancing of interests. I do think that I feel pretty certain you could enrich the pool. I also feel pretty certain you would get less valuable perspective at the end by doing that. But this is something that the board has to, this committee first, has to get comfortable with and decide where it wants to strike the balance between these legitimate interests.
Trustee,
Well, I mean, I'm assuming we're operating under the assumption that when we conduct a search, we want to see the best people for that post, and we want to compare and contrast. So starting on that very basic premise, anything and everything that we can do to reach that goal is what we must do. So we've gotten better recruiters over the years. I mean, we served on a famous search once many years ago where the candidates were not so great, and it was a function of the recruiter, and that person showed them the door and never came back. So there are things that we continue to do to improve our pool. And if what I'm hearing, and it's rings of truth, that the public nature of these searches at the end are keeping some people away, then I think we have to focus very carefully on how to change that. And I also agree with my colleague to my right, Professor Attell, that there is value there. And I do think if we think about it, there is a middle ground. But I think if I had to pick one premise to start with is we need to make sure we have the best people. These searches are now national in nature, and we want to make sure we're getting the best people.
Great.
It's great.
All right. So how would you like for us to proceed in getting to the go? I assume you need us to come to some agreement by the board meeting.
Why don't you take this under advisement at the moment? We'll work, Secretary and the council and I will work with you on getting some additional feedback from faculty and students, really the two main interested groups in this process. And if there are questions from the committee in the meantime to follow up on this, we'll try to provide some more information for you.
I think that's fair.
Yep.
There being no additional items for discussion, we'll have a motion for adjournment. So moved. Second? Been moved and second. Good evening.